This episode is brought to you by Mortgage Workflow Partners and the Mastering Encompass series, both for users as well as administrators. You can find out all the information about it over at masteringencompass.com. Also, if you'd like to check out what we're doing on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel using the @MasteringEncompass handle. And make sure you stay up to date on all the information, not just with podcasts, but also video content that we bring to you as often as possible. Now let's get on to the episode. Hi, everyone. Larry Bailey here with Mastering Encompass. Thanks very much for joining. We are going through another week of what happened last week with regards to the weekly newsletter for market information. There is a ton of information to get through and a lot of exciting information that's going to be happening this week. But before we get there, always remember that you can go to masteringencompass.com. This is both for admins as well as users. We all know that Encompass is used by a ton of companies. But let's be honest about it. Who's actually trained you on how to use it in the most efficient ways, best ways possible? That's what we do each and every day. Check out all the information at masteringencompass.com. Join the community. We'll see you there. Let's get into last week's review. This is going to review the information for the week of December 9th, 2024. Consumer and wholesale inflation moved higher in November, while the latest unemployment filings also surprised to the upside. Let's go through these stories now. We have the first story as annual consumer inflation inches upward. The next story is wholesale inflation hotter than forecasted. The next story is initial jobless claims spike higher. The next story is family hack of the week. We'll see what that's all about. And then last but not least, let's go to see what we're going to be looking at, what to expect for this week, the week of December 16th. Only 1 week to Christmas, depending on what holiday you celebrate. The reality is, hopefully, the stores are going to be discounting things even more. Speaking of that, we've got annual consumer inflation inching upward. That's our very first story. So we see the consumer price index graph that's brought on here. And the story is as follows. The latest consumer price index, that's a CPI, that showed that inflation rose 0.3% in November, with the annual reading coming in at 2.7%. While this was an uptick from the 2.6% year over year in September and 2.4% year over year in August, it was in line with what economists had forecasted. The core measure, which strips out the volatile food and energy prices, that increased 0.3% from October. And while the annual reading held steady at 3.3%, these figures also were met expectations. It's important to note that shelter costs remain the largest contributor to the core CPI, and they are still overstated due to a lagging effect. Inflation would be lower if more real-time shelter costs were better reflected in this reporting. Bottom line in this story, gang, is the latest inflation report. It comes to us ahead of the Fed's two-day meeting, Tuesday and Wednesday this week, where they will be deciding whether or not to cut benchmark Fed funds rate, which you remember is not tied to mortgage interest rates or even long-term lending rates. Fed funds rate is a very short-term rate. It literally means it's an interest rate that's only going to be good for overnight from banks borrowing money from the Federal Reserve, as well as to each other. So it is a building block of interest rates as that's important. Remember, the Fed began aggressively hiking the Fed funds rate back in 2022 to curb runaway inflation. More recently, cooling consumer inflation and rising unemployment caused the Fed to start cutting the Fed funds rate by 50 basis points at their annual meeting in September of this year. A 25 basis point cut followed in November 7th, and markets are currently expecting another 25 basis point cut this Wednesday. We'll see if it happens. The next story is wholesale inflation hotter than expected. The producer price index, that's the PPI, that measures the inflation on the wholesale level. That rose 0.4% in November, which was double the estimate of the 0.2% rise expected. The annual reading jumped an upwardly revised 2.6 to 3%. It's a big jump, gang. It's much harder than the 2.6 the market was anticipating. This is not going to bode well probably for the Federal Reserve meeting, which again, we'll see what happens. The core PPI, which strips out the volatile food and energy prices, that rose to 0.2% for the month, and the year-over-year reading held steady at an upwardly revised 3.4%. Bottom line, while the stalling prices on inflation have caused some fears that it's reemerging, we need to look at the numbers in context. So November's 3% year-over-year PPI reading is well below the peak of 11.7% seen in 2022. A spike in prices for chicken eggs, which was up 55%, and fruits and vegetables, which was up 31%, accounted for half of the monthly headline inflation readings. Eggs, and vegetables, which would have been in line with estimates otherwise. Still, the PPI data is important because some of the components are factored into another inflation measure called the personal consumption expenditures. And if you've been listening to me, you know that's the Fed's favorite measure of inflation. We still need to see if these PPI readings cause an upside surprise to the PCE when it's reported to us later this week on December 20th. Next story is initial jobless claims spiking higher. So the number of people filing for unemployment benefits for the very first time jumped last week, as initial jobless claims rose 17,000 to 242,000. There were also 1.886 million people still receiving benefits for filing their initial claim. This marked a 15,000 person jump in continuing claims from the previous week. Bottom line, gang, is that the initial jobless claims came in well above estimates, hitting the highest amount in almost 2 months. Though this increase could reflect volatility in filings that can occur around the holidays. The previous report measured the week that included Thanksgiving, so remember, if people filed because they were traveling or busy for a holiday, this could have caused a spike in otherwise latest report. Meanwhile, continuing claims remained elevated, now topping 1.8 million for the 27th week in a row. These filings continue to reflect the hiring slowdowns that we've seen and the challenges for some people experiencing trying to find a new job, as they look around the marketplace. So let's get into the family hack of the week. If you're listening to me on podcast, thank you very much. If you're watching along on Mastering Encompass or Mortgage.community or on YouTube, here's where you'll see the family hack of the week. This sugar cookie recipe is brought to you by the New York Times. I love a good sugar cookie. Check out how to make this from scratch and have some fun with the family while you make them. Here's what we're looking for this week. We've got the Fed's two-day meeting that begins Tuesday with their monetary policy statement announcing their rate cut decision and press conference following Wednesday afternoon. Plus, there's a full week of economic reports ahead. In housing news, we'll see this month's home builder confidence on Tuesday, November's housing starts and building permits Wednesday, and existing home sales Thursday. Also look for November's retail sales Tuesday and the latest jobless claims and third quarter GDP, respectively, on Thursday. And the Fed's favorite measure of inflation, that's the personal consumption expenditures. We talked about that. That's coming out on the 20th, also known as Friday. My name's Larry Bailey. I'm telling you, if you're using Compass, and I know you probably do, check out what's going on masteringencompass.com and always ask how we can help you do better in your workflow. We do a lot of reviews, a lot of technology reviews and settings reviews. Basically, if it touches Encompass or the masters, we want to help you master Encompass. That's what we're all about. We'll catch you on the next one. Be well. Bye-bye.